It's been over 600 days since Final Fantasy XVI was announced during the PlayStation 5 showcase event. But even though we still have no idea when the game will release and only have the loose window of spring 2022 for when we will next receive more information about the game, it's quite surprising how much has been divulged already. This comes in spite of Yoshida deciding with his team that they would rather make a big splash than drip feed information, with much of what we're going to talk about in this video coming from detective work and small updates provided here and there over the past 18 months. But when combined with what has already been revealed on a wider scale, it does provide pretty strong hints as to what we might expect to see within the final product, as well as who's working on the game. And it means, throughout this video, we are going to be taking an extensive deep dive, compiling every morsel of known information that we could find about Final Fantasy XVI, and we're going to be doing it in our typical granular style. So strap yourselves in, as it's time to get investigative, as we start off with staff, before exploring the known lore, production and gameplay elements, and then finish off with some talk about the potential release date. Now, so far, there are only 3 confirmed individuals working on Final Fantasy XVI: the director, the producer, and the person who is probably going to be in charge of localization. But there are plenty more unconfirmed individuals who we can assume are working on the project based on either their work history or their online activities. First though, let's start off with Hiroshi Takai, who it was confirmed will be directing Final Fantasy XVI alongside the game's announcement on the 17th of September 2020. Takai has been at Square Enix for a considerable amount of time, over 3 decades in fact, having joined the company when it was known as Square back in 1991. His first role was on Final Fantasy IV, where he assisted towards the end of production, no doubt doing some last-minute debugging alongside the likes of Tetsuya Nomura and Shinichi Kamioka. But after that, even though he worked on backgrounds for the battle scenes as well as monster designs on Final Fantasy V, he would spend much more time working under Akitoshi Kawazu on the Saga franchise. It would see Takai working on Romancing Saga as well as its 2 sequels and Saga Frontier before moving on to Legend of Mana and The Bouncer. Each of these games would be overseen by Kawazu, but Takai's stock would gradually increase, with him serving as an art director on Saga Frontier and as a planner on The Bouncer. With the Saga team pulled in to help with the delivery of Final Fantasy XI, Takai worked as a visual effects designer, but he also helped with some of the gameplay elements and was responsible for coming up with the popular skill chain mechanic. Following this, as he was a key member of the Saga team, Takai was called back to work on the enhanced remake of Romancing Saga for the PlayStation 2, but instead of being in charge of visuals, this time Takai was installed as the game's battle director. Upon completing the project, Takai would then receive his big break, but it did not come in the most idealist circumstances. Square Enix had been desperate to release games for the next generation of consoles, but producing high-definition games proved to be much more difficult than they had expected. To ensure they weren't left behind, the decision was made to license Unreal Engine 3, as they believed this would allow for faster production and reduced development costs. But as nobody at the company had any experience working with third-party engines, not least producing a game of this size and scale, it proved to be a significant challenge for Takai and the rest of his team, as this was the task they were assigned. It would be the very definition of a trial by fire, with many aspects of the game needed to be scaled back, but The Last Remnant did still ship in 2008, and despite it receiving middling reviews upon its release in the West, Famitsu scored it as a 38 out of 40, also rewarding the game their rookie grand prize. Takai then joined Yoshida as part of the task force that was established to restore Final Fantasy XIV owing to their previous working relationship. He would act as the assistant director for everything relating to the game up until the release of Stormblood. He has since been listed in the Special Thanks section of Shadowbringers and Endwalker, and alongside being the director on Final Fantasy XVI, has been promoted to being the design section manager within Creative Business Unit 3. Naoki Yoshida needs no real introduction. His vision and leadership skills are what ended up turning Final Fantasy XIV from one of the biggest disasters in the history of video gaming into one of the biggest successes in the history of video gaming. Before that, despite Yoshida joining Square Enix with the hopes of working with Yasumi Matsuno, he was assigned to the Dragon Quest team, and with Matsuno leaving not too long after, he would not get that chance until well over a decade later. As part of the Dragon Quest team, Yoshida oversaw the Monster Battle Road series, which had a primary focus on Japanese arcades, and assisted with game design on Dragon Quest X when it was in its early stages. It's unconfirmed, but it's believed that Final Fantasy XVI will be based around a concept that Yoshida has himself developed, with Sakai being made responsible for delivering that concept. He shared with us, back in 2017, that he had dreams of creating an offline Final Fantasy that was rooted in high fantasy, and he has since echoed this view at the Paris Fans Festival, as he noted that he'd like to see a Final Fantasy that was much more straightforward and didn't rely on machinery and mechanized weapons. The third confirmed staff member we know that's working on Final Fantasy XVI is Michael Christopher Koji Fox, who has forged a significant reputation thanks to his work on localizing Final Fantasy XIV. Koji Fox joined the company in and around the merger between Square and Enix, and initially worked on Final Fantasy XI as a translator, working under Richard Honeywood. This would be supplemented by contributions to Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, and Crisis Core. But with Final Fantasy XIV ramping up, Koji Fox was promoted to be in charge of translation direction as well as the English localization. Koji Fox retained that role following the arrival of Yoshida, but as was revealed during the 68th Letter with the Producer Live, after the release of Shadowbringers, he had stepped down, with Catherine Quinner taking over. Koji Fox is still providing general supervision on 14, but the reason he stepped away was so that he could focus on Final Fantasy XVI, and according to Yoshida, he has been doing so since mid-2019. In the list of staff that are pretty much confirmed, we're first going to start with Kazutoyo Maehiro. Having joined Square in 1995, Maehiro worked as a design assistant on Dynami Tracer, an odd adventure game for the Satellaview that was conceived by Tetsuya Nomura, directed by Hiroki Chiba, had music composed by Noboru Uematsu, and had a Tonberry as one of the playable characters. After that, Maehiro joined Matsuno's team, working on Tactics, Vagrant Story, the PlayOnline Viewer, Tactics Advance, and Final Fantasy XII. But throughout this period, his role would change dramatically. On Tactics, Maehiro would be responsible for creating the interactive sound novels that were subsequently removed from the English localization. On Vagrant Story, he was put in charge of creating all the game's background assets. On Tactics Advance, he was put in charge of quest design. And on Final Fantasy XII and the International Zodiac job system, he was put in charge of battle system design, implementing Ito's grand new vision. Maehiro would then join Tokai as a lead planner on The Last Remnant, where he would again be responsible for battle system design, but after also being part of the task force established to salvage Final Fantasy XIV, he assumed the role of main scenario writer. This role would then be maintained on Heavensward, where he also became development supervisor alongside Tokai, but even though he continued being a development supervisor on Stormblood, Maehiro was replaced as the main scenario writer by Natsuko Ishikawa and Banri Oda. It could have been seen as a coincidence that Maehiro-san's credits on Final Fantasy XIV have since mirrored that of Tokai, with special thanks offered in both Shadowbringers and Endwalker, but Yasumi Matsudo, Maehiro's longtime leader, accidentally confirmed that he would be working on Final Fantasy XVI. Matsudo was responding to a fan not too long after the announcement of the game, and was attempting to shoot down rumours and speculation that he was involved with the project, but in doing so, he stated that the reason he wasn't involved was because Maehiro would be responsible for taking legacies of the past and making them his own. Matsuno subsequently deleted the tweet, replacing it with a version that did not mention Maehiro's name, but that didn't stop it being picked up by numerous people outside of the aforementioned tweet. As for Maehiro's role on Final Fantasy XVI, well, that's up for debate. Due to him acting as the main scenario writer for A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, it would make sense for him to continue in that role, but he has since been made the Game Design Section Director of Creative Business Unit 3, so he could be involved with the creation of Final Fantasy XVI's battle system or some wider gameplay concepts. Another staff member who's pretty much confirmed is Ryoto Suzuki. Compared to many of the other senior figures who have been mentioned in relation to 16, Suzuki is a bit of an outlier, and that's because he only joined Square Enix in 2019. Prior to that, Suzuki had forged a pretty strong reputation at Capcom, working on games with an action focus. This started off with Suzuki working as a planner on the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure fighting game that was released back in 1998, and he would fulfill a similar role on other fighting games such as Marvel vs. Capcom, Capcom vs. SNK, and the Darkstalkers collection. After that, Suzuki would take on a few different roles at Capcom. He would act as one of the field battle planners on Onimusha Dawn of Dreams, and as an effects designer on Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. But the big change came with Dragon's Dogma, where after acting as a game player lead on the original game, he was promoted to game design lead for its expansion, Dark Arisen. Suzuki would then serve as one of the designers on Devil May Cry 5 before leaving to join Square Enix and becoming a focal point within Creative Business Unit 3. The following year, Suzuki conducted an interview with Silicon Studio, a recruitment firm that represents Square Enix. Suzuki explained that he was currently acting as a battle director for a new upcoming AAA game within Creative Business Unit 3. So unless they're working on another AAA game alongside Final Fantasy XIV and 16, it's safe to assume that Suzuki will be the battle director working on 16. And not only is this interesting in itself, as Dragon's Dogma has some very specific elements that help to define it as one of the best modern-era role-playing games to have been produced by a Japanese company, gaining a cult following that has spawned a Japanese-exclusive MMO that stayed active for 4 years, as well as its own Netflix series. But the hiring of Suzuki represents the second major poaching of talent from Capcom, as Teruhi Endo, who is one of the lead game designers on Monster Hunter World, served as the battle director on the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Kazuya Takahashi is another staff member who it's safe to assume is working on Final Fantasy XVI. After joining Square in the build-up to Final Fantasy IX, Takahashi joined the rather large field map graphics team, fulfilling a similar role in Final Fantasy X and then Final Fantasy XI, before again serving as part of the background art design team working on the original version of Final Fantasy XIV. It meant Takahashi had been in a similar role for over 10 years at the company, but after the Final Fantasy XIV task force was put in place, he was moved into the character concept art team, a role he retained up until the release of Heavensward. However, after the release of Heavensward, Kazuya Takahashi was replaced in the credits by Sari Takahashi, and neither have been listed in Final Fantasy XIV's credits since the release of Shadowbringers. Takahashi's social media activity has also been quite interesting. Prior to the announcement of Final Fantasy XVI, it would see numerous pieces of Final Fantasy XIV artwork posted or retweeted. But after retweeting about the launch of the official Final Fantasy XVI website, Takahashi has only made 2 tweets, both of which have related to 2 unknown characters. There's been a high degree of speculation that one relates to an older version of Jill Warwick, but outside of that, it's believed that Takahashi has been responsible for much of the concept art we've seen so far relating to Clive, Joshua, and Jill. The final staff member who we're pretty confident is involved is Masayoshi Soken. Having joined Square Enix not too long after the merger, Soken started out working on a few of Square Enix Japan's supplemental properties. It saw him join other composers to provide original compositions for the soundtracks of Front Mission 5, Mario Hoops 3 on 3, and Dawn of Mana, before then joining the Final Fantasy XIV original team as its sound director, where he oversaw Uematsu's original works. Soken would then become one of Yoshida's biggest allies throughout the evolution of Final Fantasy XIV, and alongside retaining his role as sound director, he would also compose numerous pieces of music. For A Realm Reborn, Soken was promoted to the role of principal composer, providing the majority of music heard within the reimagined version of the game, and even though many other musicians have contributed over the years, Soken has remained in this role, and such has been his dedication that he even carried on composing music for Shadowbringers while fighting off cancer. As a supportive ally, Soken has been keen to promote Final Fantasy XVI wherever possible, but has stopped short of confirming his involvement. However, as many far more talented musicians have pointed out, such as our good friend Alex McCullough, Soken's DNA was all over the music that featured within the Awakening trailer. That doesn't necessarily mean that Soken will be writing music for the actual soundtrack, but it would be surprising if he wasn't involved in some capacity. In terms of individuals who are a bit more speculative, first there's Mitsutoshi Gondai. After joining Square in the build-up to Final Fantasy XI's launch, Gondai was assigned as part of the technical QA team. By the release of Chains of Promathia, Gondai had been promoted to Battle Data Planner, and he kept this role up until the release of Wings of the Goddess. Having impressed, Gondai was next assigned to work on Final Fantasy XIV, joining the Battle Planning team. But despite the game's terrible performance, Yoshida decided to keep Gondai within his reworked team, even promoting him to Lead Battle Planner as part of the internal shakeup. Gondai would later be promoted further still to Assistant Director for Heavensward, fulfilling the role of Development Supervisor on Stormblood. But even though there was speculation that he had stepped down, as he was listed in the Special Thanks section of patch 4.56 alongside Takai and My Hero, Gondai would return to Shadowbringers as one of the lead level designers, and then as a lead game designer for Endwalker. This could suggest that Gondai was either working on 16 during its initial planning, but was moved back onto Final Fantasy XIV later, or that he just took a sabbatical, and it just happened to coincide with when Takai and My Hero also stepped down. Someone else who's been speculated is Tsubasa Masao. Having worked at Konami for many years and working on games like Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 and Zone of the Ender's second runner, Masao left after completing work on Metal Gear Acid 2. At Square Enix, Masao worked on Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light before joining the Final Fantasy XIV team, working as a character concept artist alongside Kazuya Takahashi. But Masao left Square Enix after the release of Heavensward, joining DNA. DNA do work on Final Fantasy games, but Masao has contributed to Fire Emblem Heroes as well as Pokémon Masters. They could have rejoined Square Enix to work on Final Fantasy XVI, but that does feel rather unlikely. Another rumoured person is Kenji Sudo, who was responsible for the Ultimate Bahamut raid, as they have not been part of Final Fantasy XIV following the release of Stormblood. But just as a small hazard to credit diving, Hideyuki Kasuga, who was the technical director for Heavensward and Stormblood, has also not been involved since, but that's because he chose to leave Square Enix in order to launch his own company called VMeets. Alright, so now that we know a lot of the prominent staff members who will be working on Final Fantasy XVI, let's talk about what we know about the actual story and the wider lore, and we're better to start than with Clive Rossfield. Clive will serve as the main protagonist of Final Fantasy XVI, but despite being the firstborn son of the Archduke of Rosaria, not everything has gone to plan for the heir apparent. According to the in-game lore that's been revealed, Clive was supposed to inherit the power of Phoenix, the fire icon, from his father, something that would have seen him become the new dominant, but instead it passed to his younger brother, Joshua. With Clive's supposed destiny unfulfilled, he was forced to find meaning elsewhere and decided to devote his life to the martial arts, becoming the first Shield of Rosaria, swearing to protect his younger brother, who grants him vicarious use of Phoenix's powers. But despite being a very adept fighter and winning the Rosarian Ducal tournament, Clive is only 15 years old at the beginning of the game, and to hazard an educated guess, based on his age, it can be assumed that Clive is still learning his trade and is yet to experience the harsh realities of combat outside the safe confines of Rosaria. Many of these traits can be seen within Clive's design. For example, the sword he wields within the released concept art, which looks like a typical Fetischwart, features a schlitt. This trait is often associated with swords that are used for live sparring as opposed to live combat, as they allow for better protection and reduced risk of injury. Clive is also wearing an Aigote Kote, or connected armoured sleeves, and is wearing plated armour on top. But in general, his armour covering is quite light, with protection focused primarily around his arms, shoulders and waist. Based on the trailer and what's been revealed, we do know that some kind of terrible event will take place in Rosaria which will involve Joshua, and Clive would end up leaving Rosaria in search of revenge. It would see him join a group of mercenaries who are identified by a mark on their face, and after the time skip, it's clear that grown-up Clive is a bit more battle-hardened. The sword has been upgraded to feature a much wider base and looks like a cinquedea, although the in-game designs we've seen are a bit more standard and embellished. And although his armour is still focused around the same areas, it's now much more pronounced, and individual armour is now adorning Clive's legs alongside a cape. Joshua Rossfield will appear as the younger brother of Clive, who, pre-time skip, will be just 10 years old. Known to be the dominant of Phoenix soon after birth, much expectation has been placed on Joshua, and deep down he wishes that Clive had received the power so that he could be free from its burden. Much of this is because, unlike his brother, Joshua is a much softer individual, placing more emphasis on acquiring knowledge than improving his physical attributes. And it's perhaps because of this that despite not adopting a strong physical presence, Joshua is adored by the citizens of Rosaria due to his warm and caring demeanour, which sees him show affection for his father's subjects irrespective of their social standing. After seeing his brother win the Ducal tournament and becoming his sworn bodyguard, Joshua chooses to imbue Clive with the blessing of the Phoenix so that he can wield enough strength for the both of them. There has been a considerable amount of speculation relating to Joshua ever since the original trailer aired, as it's clear that he will be central to whatever causes Clive's quest for revenge, but some of the more interesting elements of note relate not only to his choice of name, but also his design. Many prominent staff members who were crucial to the rebuild of 14, including Yoshida and My Hero, have either worked in close proximity to Matsuno or have a strong degree of reverence for his work. Yoshida has gone on record numerous times as mentioning Tactics Ogre as his favourite game, and he has made sure that Matsuno's talents could be resurfaced in more recent times, bringing him on board to contribute to scenarios relating to content housed within Stormblood and Shadowbringers. Why is this important to Joshua? Well, for one, there is also a character called Joshua who appeared within Vagrant Story and was also the son of a duke. Their visual design is also similar, and within that narrative everything possible was done to protect Joshua from harm. However, after an incident within their own borders, so as to hide the powers wielded by Joshua's elder brother, Sidney, the Duke will be forced to order that his entire family be slain, with the exception of Joshua, who would remain unharmed. Matsuno would later reveal that Joshua was planned to have a major role within the sequel to Vacant Story, but the project was never approved, and even though some elements were reworked for the Crimson Shroud, many aspects remain within Matsuno's mind. Joshua also appears to have a symbol on his collar that resembles the Bloodsin tattoo that has been seen in other evilly-based properties. It was a prominent plot device within Vacant Story, but was also referenced within Final Fantasy XII as well as Tactics A2. It feels like there are too many of these elements present to be a mere coincidence, but we'll have to wait until we learn more to see just how deep this particular rabbit hole goes. The third major character who has been revealed so far is Jill Warwick. Jill is also part of the Rosaria nobility, but unlike Clive and Joshua, she is not a blood relative. Instead, Jill was born in the Northern Territories and was brought into the house as part of an arrangement that would see peace secured between the two nations that had previously experienced a fractious relationship. 2 years older than Joshua, Jill has performed her duties as princess admirably and has formed a close relationship with not just her two brothers, but also her adoptive father, the Archduke. This particular lore detail creates an interesting comparison between Jill and Tetra from Final Fantasy Tactics. She too was adopted into a noble family that was not her own, but was raised without discrimination. However, despite this, Tetra would still end up being used as a pawn in the wider political game, and that could be foreboding for Jill. Due to her colour palette and the fact that she's from the cold Northern Territories, there has been speculation around Jill being associated with Shiva in some way. This speculation was fueled by a piece of artwork released by Kazuyo Takahashi that showed a girl who looked not too dissimilar to Jill, albeit a little older, leaning into Shiva's colour palette even more intensely, even having a piece of ice cradled in her hand. If the scenario writers are leaning into the mindset adopted by Matsuno when creating the Ogre Battle Saga and the World of Ivalice, outside of these three characters, we can also expect there to be a considerable number of NPCs who will have a significant influence on how the story plays out. Based on the few scenes we've witnessed, it feels like we may get to see many of the power players from the various nations interacting with each other as they attempt to reconcile their differences, and there will no doubt be plenty of subterfuge too, and that brings us nicely onto the world that has been revealed so far. In October 2020, the development team disclosed that the world of Final Fantasy XVI would be known as Valisthea, which is divided into two continents, Ash to the east and Storm to the west. Outside of how similar the name is to Ivalice, we also know that the world will be quite expansive and that some of the nations will also bear similarities to nations found within Ivalice. But the main defining feature will be the Mother Crystals, huge crystalline mountains that fill the surrounding lands with ether. The many revealed nations are each tied to one of the Mother Crystals, standing as a testament to their ability to thrive while others have not. And although we're led to believe that conflict has never been too far away from this land, a peace has been brokered between many of the nations due to the spread of blood becoming far too consistent and costly. The main nation, at least towards the start of the game, will be the Grand Duchy of Rosaria. According to the revealed lore, the duchy was formed after many smaller provinces decided it would be better to pool their resources and fight as one, as opposed to battling against each other. However, after years of prosperity, something known as the Blight threatens to undo all of the good work and destabilize Rosaria. In terms of placement, it's aligned with Drake's Breath, the Mother Crystal situated on the far west of the map, and its icon is the Phoenix, aligned with the fire element. Close to Rosaria, situated off the coast of Storm, and below Drake's Breath, is the Iron Kingdom. Even though Rosaria draws its power from Drake's Breath, it is under the jurisdiction of the Iron Kingdom, and ownership has long since been a source of conflict between the two nations. Due to them being an island nation though, the Island Kingdom have distanced themselves from the mainland folk, adopting their own language as well as an extreme religion called the Crystalline Orthodoxy. They worship the crystals, but view dominance as abominations, and if any are found to have been born on their islands, they are sentenced to immediate execution. This all makes the Iron Kingdom an interesting prospect, as despite choosing not to exploit the power offered to them by the dominants, they must have access to their own sources of strength in order to deter would-be invaders, and also stand up to the might of Rosaria. It's safe to assume that to the north of Rosaria, in the darkened area of the map, once existed the Northern Territories. They were close enough to have been in conflict with Rosaria, but according to Jill's description, they have since fallen and will not appear in the main game under that name. But that's not to say that the Northern Territories don't still exist as individual states of diminished power, and as we know that Shiva will feature, it would make sense for her to have at least some tie-in with the Northern Territories, no matter how they do appear. Based on their proximity, the Northern Territories may well have drawn strength from Drake's Head, but there is another nation that was formed around its structure, the Holy Empire of Sanbreque. Described as a theocratic nation, Sanbreque is very religious, treating the Holy Emperor as a living deity. But due to how everything has been established, it's also enjoyed much more prosperity than other nations, and its citizens have access to many comforts. We also know that they too have an icon, but at this moment it has not been revealed who that icon is. To the south of Rosaria is the Dalmacian Republic. As with Rosaria, the Northern Territories and the Iron Kingdom, this is a nation comprising of 5 smaller nations. They claim ownership of Drake's Fang and have amassed a considerable amount of land. It has been revealed that the Dalmacian icon is Titan, who is aligned with the earth element, but we can infer from the Dalmacian flag that they also have an affinity with other elements such as fire, wind, water, and lightning. To the east lies the Kingdom of Waled. They have claimed jurisdiction of Drake's Spine and have used its power to unite almost the entire eastern continent of Ash under their rule. The only outliers are the Beastmen tribes, who continue to test their military strength and force the Kingdom of Waled to improve. It's not been revealed who the icon of Waled is, but based on their flag, it's pretty safe to assume that it's Odin, as the flag features a 6-legged horse and a lance. Unsubtle, as Odin rides a 6-legged horse called Sleipnir and uses a lance called Gungnir. By using their icon, who we will assume is Odin, they have been able to assert themselves and have gained considerable confidence in their strength to the point where they want to challenge the armies of the Western continent. But at the centre of Valencia resides the Crystalline Dominion. It retains ownership of Drake's Teal, which has long been since a source of bloody battles due to its strategic position. In the end, to try and bring about a cease to this bloodshed, the Crystalline Dominion became an autonomous nation, ruled by representatives from the 4 nations, excluding the Iron Kingdom. But despite having access to Drake's Teal and having no religious rules against dominance, there is no known dominant associated with the Mother Crystal. Now, we've just spoken about a few icons, and at this point 4 have been confirmed: Phoenix, Shiva, Titan, and Ifrit. There are another 2 that have been further speculated though: Odin, based on the Waled flag, and Garuda, based on gameplay footage. That makes 6, but in a now deleted tweet, we know that there will be at least 9, and there could even be more, up to 16 depending on how you want to interpret what's been revealed. Within the known lore, it's seen as a surprise that there are 2 icons of fire, with Phoenix representing the light fire icon and Ifrit the dark fire icon. This plays into another Evil East-based lore device, as within Final Fantasy XII, there were also summonable beings known as Espers or Scions, and they too were split into light and dark. Within that game, we only ever got to see the dark Espers, with the light Espers being revealed through later external materials, and what's interesting is that many of those light Espers have since been integrated into the lore of Final Fantasy XIV, such as Emet-Selch, who was the Scion of Light for the Gemini zodiac sign. Based on what's been revealed, it can be assumed that if there are 16, with there being 8 light and 8 dark, then this would make sense, as there are often 8 prime elements: fire, ice, lightning, earth, water, wind, holy, and dark. And 16 is obviously the number of the game, and Final Fantasy creators have been known over the years to place numerical illusions within their games. If we match up the known summons with 5 of those elements, it would then leave room for classic recurring summons such as Leviathan, Alexander, and Ramuh. Alright, with much of the known lore explored, it's now time to focus on development and production. It's believed that work started on Final Fantasy XVI approximately 5 to 6 years ago. Jason Schreier made this claim on his Triple Click podcast, stating that work started just before the release of Final Fantasy XV, but even without that inside information, we can also just use Square Enix's own recruitment page as evidence, as in March 2016, they announced that they were recruiting for a new project that will be developed within what was then known as Business Division 5. At this time, there would have been only a small group of people contributing, with it assumed that the group contained Yoshida and Takai. Their objective would have been to prepare a comprehensive proposal for what their vision of the game could be, and it was only after they received the green light to proceed that they began to flesh everything out. This green light would have no doubt come with a bit of trepidation though, as Yoshida had worked on a few projects before that he was unable to see through to completion due to internal changes. For example, Yoshida revealed in his Yoshida Uncensored columns and interviews that prior to being moved on to Final Fantasy XIV, he was in the process of establishing a brand new IP called Chosoku Henkai Gyrozeta. It was meant to be an arcade game that would not only receive an anime adaptation, but also a complementary 3DS game. By Yoshida's own words, he felt bad about having to bow out of the project when he did, as they were just establishing fundamental concepts, but he had no choice about the matter, and he had to trust that Ryotaro Ichimura would deliver the project in his stead. Around the same time, Yoshida was also ordered by Yuichi Wada, Yosuke Saito, and Koji Ayama to lead a full-fledged project, as they believed he was too talented to be working on someone else's vision. This was how he would get to know Hiroshi Takai and Hiroshi Minagawa in a professional capacity, as they were assigned to assist, but the three were at least familiar with each other, having been sent to Europe together to study Western development techniques a few years prior. This trip would form the basis of expectation, as Yoshida would be taken off of Dragon Quest X, tasked with developing a hardcore action game that would be able to compete with offerings from top-tier Western developers. From the outset, Yoshida wanted to make sure that the story was nailed down first. He believed that if you're in a situation where you need to change the plot or add characters midway through development, it would cause major workload changes, especially in the modern era of game development, as it would affect schedules and cause significant delays. And even though Yoshida was not able to see it through to fruition, as the project was cancelled around a year after development, with him moved on to Final Fantasy XIV, he was able to use this methodology and refine it throughout 14's history. Yoshida has noted in relation to 16 that story has again been one of the fundamental elements of the experience, and they've been working and refining it ever since they were given the green light to proceed with the project. To stress this, they only chose to start bringing more people on board once they were confident with the story they had laid down, as they wanted everything to feed off it and everyone to be confident with what they were working towards. That's not to say they didn't continue to make tweaks, however. Not too long after the game was announced, it was revealed that basic scenario production was complete, but by the 2021 Tokyo Game Show, Yoshida revealed when speaking to Sakaguchi that work on the main story was 100% complete, and that they had moved their attention to focusing on building out compelling side quests instead. As for the tone, well, Yoshida has mentioned twice now that he wants the story of Final Fantasy XVI to be rooted in the harsh realities of the real world. A year ago, when speaking with the Japanese-based radio show GameHack, Yoshida noted that the story of Final Fantasy XVI will focus on the kinds of hardships and the kinds of experiences that you encounter when you become an adult. He also hopes it will resonate with those who enjoy the stories of the earlier Final Fantasy games. This has since been echoed in recent comments relating to the Uniqlo campaign, where he said that he wants the story to appeal to people who have grown up, entered working society and think reality isn't as easy as a video game, and at some point ended up separating from Final Fantasy. In terms of scheduling, we also know that mass production started towards the start of 2019, just before the pandemic hit. Square Enix revealed this update via their recruitment website again, as they declared that early development stages were now complete, with final preparations being conducted for its development environment. The next phase will be full-scale development, and that they were hoping to hire a ton of developers who will be able to surprise gamers and challenge expectations within their native Japan, but also on a global scale. And this is quite an interesting note, as when Yoshida was working on the cancelled Western-focused game, he was known for giving younger people a chance to show what they could do, often giving them extra time to try and figure out creative solutions instead of just doing the work for them. Even though Takai didn't necessarily agree with this approach, as it ended up taking longer, Yoshida has shown on Final Fantasy XIV that he is keen to promote people from within and push people into senior positions irrespective of time served if they show enough aptitude. Yoshida has also revealed that the English script and performance capture is being prioritized over the Japanese version. Koji Fox has no doubt been a major factor here, and one of the main reasons could be to ensure that the characters behave in the expected manner. In Final Fantasy XII, for example, every single character had motion capture performances by Japanese actors, except Balthier, who had a Western motion capture artist. The rationale was that Balthier needed to have a different set of mannerisms, and that a Japanese actor would not be able to capture it in a natural way. To further emphasize this, Yoshida revealed that they will be doing full facial motion capture for the English actors to make sure that the expressions they use and their lips match up as best as they can to what is being said. It's an interesting choice, as the Final Fantasy VII Remake used AI-based facial animations and lip sync, but perhaps because Final Fantasy XVI will feature characters with English accents as opposed to American ones, they felt that facial capture would produce much better results. Yoshida has also revealed that Final Fantasy XVI will feature a robust and expansive skill tree system, which will allow for unique and personal character growth that will suit individual playstyles, and that it will also contain a story-focused difficulty mode, no doubt similar to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, for those who aren't as accustomed to action-based gameplay. So where are we now though? Well, during Yoshida's year-end comments with 4Gamer, he noted that 2022 would be a year of refinement, suggesting that most of the heavy lifting was complete, and it was more about pushing the graphics as far as they could go and tweaking various mechanics and difficulty settings to make sure it's as enjoyable as possible. But we also know that the game was impacted quite heavily by the pandemic. Right at the end of the year, Yoshida gave a very refreshing and honest update. At the end of 2020, Yoshida had promised that we would be getting a big reveal at some point during 2021. But on the 27th of December, Yoshida published a statement explaining why it had not happened. To summarize, even though they had built a very talented team consisting of great internal and external talent, the pandemic led to numerous issues relating around communication and the subsequent delivery of assets. Much of 2021 was spent attempting to overcome those issues, with focus in 2022 now being to optimize as much as possible. At this point though, we still have no idea when Final Fantasy XVI will release, but it does feel like the wait isn't going to be too much longer. Within that previous statement, Yoshida noted that we were going to have a big reveal in spring 2022, and he has since stated during a recent Nier Reincarnation livestream that the trailer is done. The re-reveal has just been delayed a bit due to certain factors. So that means we should be very confident about expecting to see something before the 21st of June 2022. As for what we'll see, well, it may end up being very different from what we saw before. Yoshida was quite candid about the reveal trailer, stating that he wanted to show in-game footage to counter sarcastic comments from Americans that often accompanied CG trailers, but there was also an appreciation that it was perhaps not the best showing, and this big re-reveal should be much closer to the original vision. As for when the game will be released though, well, there's speculation that it could arrive as soon as September. Yoshida has previously stated that he wants there to be a very short period of time between the re-reveal and the game's actual release date, as he wants there to be maximum excitement and limited amount of time for that excitement to subside. Yoshida also noted in a statement that appeared as part of the Final Fantasy 30th Anniversary Unico collaboration that the game is in the final stages of development. Another piece of the puzzle is Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which was originally scheduled to release in September, but has since been moved up to the 29th of July. Perhaps Nintendo caught wind that a big game within the same genre was planning to release around the same time, and opted to avoid instead of trying to go head to head. Then there's Yoshida's comments that Final Fantasy XVI had been delayed by 6 months, and there has been speculation that the original release date for Final Fantasy XVI was Q1 2022. Either way, we hope you've enjoyed this rather lengthy look at everything we currently know about Final Fantasy XVI, and are eagerly anticipating the upcoming re-reveal, which should be happening pretty soon. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, as we're bound to have way more Final Fantasy XVI content coming in the future. Alright, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube members and supporters, especially Anthony Hoffman, Benjamin Snow, the Livestream, and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.